shores, hills, and the quiet habit of wonder. Long before anyone used the word philosophy, before schools and scrolls and arguments framed in careful logic, the lands we now call ancient Greece were simply a collection of quiet places, rocky coasts, terraced hills, small islands scattered across a slow, reflective sea. In those days, life unfolded at a pace shaped more by daylight and weather than by plans or ambitions. Villages clung to slopes that looked down toward harbors. Stone paths wound between houses with flat or gently sloping roofs. Olive trees stood along terraces like patient guardians, their leaves catching the light in a soft, silver shimmer when the wind passed through. The people who lived here were not yet philosophers. They were farmers, sailors, potters, herders, weavers, traders. Their days began with low, familiar sounds. The grinding of grain, the creak of wooden doors, the distant murmur of waves repeating themselves against stone. In small coastal towns, the sea was always present, sometimes visible between houses, sometimes only heard as a distant, steady rumble. Fishermen prepared their boats in the early light, checking nets, running fingers along ropes, feeling for frayed spots that needed mending. Children carried baskets of bread or jars of olives down to the harbor, their steps careful on worn stone. Behind these towns, hills rose in gentle layers, covered with scrub, pines, and orderly rows of vines. Footpaths climbed slowly upward, passing fields where farmers bent over stony soil, coaxing barley and wheat from ground that demanded more patience than strength. The air carried the scent of earth, thyme, and the faint sharpness of pine resin warmed by the sun. In the evenings, when the day's work faded, people sat outside their doorways or on flat rooftops, letting the sky darken slowly above them. Torches flickered in courtyards. Oil lamps cast small circles of warm light on whitewashed walls. Nearby, goats settled, their bells chiming faintly as they shifted in their enclosures. Above all this, the sky unfolded in long, patient arcs. The same stars returned night after night, moving gently along paths that seemed fixed and yet slowly shifting across the year. On clear evenings, the Milky Way stretched overhead like a pale, blurred river of light. Planets, though no one yet had that word, glowed more steadily than the stars around them, wandering slowly across constellations whose shapes had been named in older times. People had stories for these lights and patterns, myths carried in memory and spoken softly by elders, tales of gods and heroes, of storms shaped by anger, of islands formed from divine decisions. These stories did not feel distant or abstract. They were woven directly into daily life, into the seasons, into the movements of wind and water. But alongside these stories, something else existed. Something quieter. Something less dramatic and more patient. There were people who sat a little longer watching the sky after others had gone to sleep. Sailors who, during long voyages between islands, stared not only at the waves but also at the stars that guided them. Farmers who noticed that certain winds brought predictable changes in weather. Shepherds who spent long hours in the hills, listening to the silence between bell chimes and watching clouds drift across distant peaks. These people did not yet think of themselves as seekers of wisdom. They simply had time, long stretches of calm time, to notice. They noticed that the moon changed shape in a regular, gentle cycle. They noticed that some stars rose always in the same portion of the sky just before dawn at certain times of the year. They noticed that the shadows of trees and walls shortened and lengthened in predictable rhythms. They noticed the way stones, when dropped, always fell downward, never sideways or upward. Nothing about these observations felt revolutionary. They were part of the background of life, like the sound of the sea or the feel of dust under feet. Still, over years and generations, these observations accumulated. They formed quiet patterns in the minds of those who paid attention. Someone might ask, not loudly, but in the privacy of a small conversation, Why does the same star appear above that hill before the harvest? Or, why do some winds bring rain while others always come dry? And another might answer, not with a definitive explanation, but with more observations, more careful remarks, more gentle questions. In this way, thought itself gained texture. Not wild, impulsive thought, but slow, attentive thought shaped by the habit of watching the world repeatedly and noticing what stayed the same. The villages and small towns of the Greek coasts and islands were full of such half-formed reflections, spoken in passing, remembered in silence. There were shrines to the gods, of course, simple stone altars, small temples with columns and painted roofs. People brought offerings, whispered prayers, and shared stories about divine choices and interventions. But just as often, after leaving a shrine, someone would pause, glance at the sky, and wonder, not whether the gods acted, but how the world itself moved so consistently beneath them. The land offered many places for solitary thinking. Rocky outcrops above the sea where a person could sit and hear only wind and waves. Olive groves where trunks twisted slowly over centuries, creating pockets of shade that invited long rests. Simple stone benches beside fountains where water fell endlessly, drop by drop, each one striking the basin below with the same soft sound. In these spaces, questions could arise without urgency. What is this world made of? What lies beneath earth, sea, and sky? Why does change happen at all? At first, such questions were like faint ripples on a still surface, noticed only by a few, quickly fading. But the more people watched, the more these ripples returned. Not as grand theories, not as bold declarations, but as gently repeated thoughts. Little by little, without anyone naming the process, a new way of relating to the world took shape. Not instead of myth, but alongside it. Not against the gods, but beneath them, an attempt to understand the quiet rules by which the world seemed to behave. It was not yet philosophy. It was a leaning toward philosophy. A soft turning of attention away from who willed this, toward how does this come to be. And in the calm evenings of early Greek life, on rooftops, on hillsides, on the decks of slowly moving ships, that leaning grew steadily stronger, like a steady breeze rising over a long, quiet sea. Yet their effect was subtle and persistent. They taught listeners that the world was larger than what they saw each day. That other lands had different soils, plants, stars at different angles, winds with different characters. That what felt natural in one place was not necessarily universal. In the minds of attentive listeners, these differences slowly formed a quiet puzzle. If the world was the work of gods, why did it vary in such orderly, patterned ways from region to region? If storms, winds, and floods were simply moods of divine beings, why did they follow predictable cycles? Again, these were not shouted questions. They were soft questions, tucked into a corner of the mind, returning during still moments. Sometimes, at the edge of a harbor, where stone met water, a person might stand looking out across the sea and think, the same moon that shines here shines over those distant lands. The same stars we see rise above other people. And yet their weather, their soil, their rivers differ. What is it that remains the same beneath all these differences? In small workshops near the market, craftspeople contributed their own quiet observations. A potter noticed that some clays responded differently to fire, hardening more or less depending on where the earth had been taken. A metalworker observed that certain stones, when heated and hammered, behaved as if they contained hidden strength. A builder realized that particular kinds of stone or wood carried loads more reliably than others. These were not philosophical conclusions. They were practical understandings. But in some minds, practice and curiosity overlapped. A potter might wonder why clay transformed so completely when baked. A metalworker might ask why fire changed matter from hard to soft and back again. A builder might consider why some materials resisted time better than others. In taverns near the harbor, where sailors rested after voyages, conversation sometimes drifted from stories of storms and safe passages into more reflective territories. One might say, "The sea is unpredictable." And another, more thoughtful, might respond, "Yes, but its tides and winds are not entirely so." Someone might observe, "The God sent a storm." And another might quietly add, "Yet storms come at certain times more often than others." Such comments did not deny the presence of gods in people's minds. But they opened a small space, a narrow, fragile space where one could ask, what if, beneath the will of gods, there are steady patterns? What if the world, in its changing forms, rests upon something that does not change? On the outskirts of these towns, quiet spaces invited such questions to deepen. Low stone walls marked the boundaries of small fields. Beyond them, gently rising hills provided simple vantage points from which one could see both sea and land, town and countryside, harbor and temple. From such vantage points, the contrast became clear. The sea was always moving. The clouds shifted shapes. The people came and went. Boats arrived and departed. But the hills themselves remained. The underlying rock did not change. The overall shape of the coastline stayed the same through countless cycles of tide and storm. A thoughtful observer might sit on a rock overlooking this view and feel a soft, persistent question forming. What lasts beneath everything that changes? This question did not yet have vocabulary like substance or essence. It did not call itself metaphysics. It existed as a faint, almost wordless curiosity, a feeling that there must be something stable under the flowing motions of daily life. The older myths explained the world through stories of divine action. Thunder as a god's anger. Earthquakes as a god's movement. Winds as the breath or wings of unseen beings. These stories still held power. They still framed festivals, sacrifices, and songs. Yet in daily life, in the small quiet acts of watching, measuring, comparing, and recalling, a second layer of understanding emerged, a layer rooted not in story, but in pattern. Farmers recognized planting times through environmental cues. Sailors learned to trust certain winds. Craftspeople predicted how materials would behave. Traders knew which months favored long voyages. All these things suggested, quietly, that the world operated according to dependable relations. In the minds of a few, a new attitude toward these relations began to take shape. Not content with using them, they wanted to understand them. Not to control the world, but to feel at home in it by knowing its quieter foundations. On some evenings, in shaded courtyards behind busy streets, a small group might gather, friends, relatives, neighbors. After the meal was finished and the lamps lit, conversation slowed. Someone might remark on the stars, or the changing color of the sea at a particular hour, or the way the air felt just before certain winds arrived. And then one person, perhaps almost absent-mindedly, might ask, "What do you think everything is made of?" The question would hang in the air. Not as a challenge. Not as a debate. Just as an invitation to wonder. Someone might say of earth and water and fire and air, echoing older ideas heard from poets or travelers. Another might respond, "Yes, but what lies beneath those? Are they themselves final, or are they forms of something simpler, deeper, more unified?" No one needed to agree. Agreement was not the goal. The goal, if it could be called that, was simply to sit in the presence of the question. These were the earliest steps toward what would later be named philosophy. The love of wisdom. The slow turning of attention from stories explaining who caused something, toward reflections exploring how and what the world quietly is. In these harbors, markets, courtyards, and hillsides, philosophy was not born in a single moment. It did not appear as a sudden spark. It emerged like a slow dawn. First as a faint light behind the horizon of everyday life. Then as a soft glow touching the edges of familiar shapes. And only much later as something that people would recognize, name, and organize. For now, it remained what it had always been at its beginning. A gentle habit of wondering. Shared in low voices. Beneath the patient stars and along the steady shores of the ancient Greek world. It stirred a quiet question. If the world were ruled entirely by the unpredictable wills of gods, how could such patterns remain so stable across places and generations? In Miletus, a few individuals began to give such questions more space, not hurriedly, not boldly, but steadily. Among them was a man named Thales, though at this early stage he was not yet the father of Western philosophy, not yet associated with statements or theories. In this period, he was simply an attentive citizen, someone known for listening carefully to sailors, for watching shadows cast by the sun, for observing how land behaved after rain, for noticing that water seemed involved in nearly every transformation around him. He did not perform experiments. He did not write treatises. He watched. He watched the way moisture formed on cool surfaces after warm days. He watched how seeds swelled when soaked and how plants withered without water. He watched how steam rose from heated pots, how dew settled before dawn, how rivers carved paths through soil. He asked, quietly, "What if water is the beginning of all things?" This was not a claim of authority. It was the soft suggestion of someone trying to see unity beneath diversity. In the workshops of Miletus, such observations found fertile ground. Potters who worked with clay understood how water changed its texture. Metalworkers saw how moisture affected ores and how steam emerged from heated materials. Builders saw how water shaped stone and soil. Farmers saw how fields responded to the rhythms of rain. No one yet spoke of elements or principles. That vocabulary would come later. But people began to reflect on a deeper question. What lies beneath the forms we see? Such reflections unfolded during quiet tasks. A fisherman repairing nets while listening to the sea. A woman grinding grain as sunlight shifted across the floor. A shepherd on a hillside with hours to observe the slow drift of clouds. Patterns became noticeable. Waves always rose and fell. Clouds always formed and dissipated. The sun always rose and set. Seeds always turned toward growth when nurtured by moisture. These steady rhythms suggested that beneath the shifting world lay something consistent, something that could be thought about independently of myth. Myths remained important, rituals continued, temples stood, festivals unfolded, but another layer of explanation began taking shape, one that did not replace myth but gently sat beside it. In the evenings, the harbor of Miletus often glowed with soft lamplight. Merchants finished their day's work and shared meals in courtyards. The air carried the scent of cooked barley, figs, olive oil, and herbs. Dogs rested near doorways, their ears twitching occasionally at distant noises. Children counted stars, sometimes asking questions about why certain constellations appeared earlier in one season than another. Parents did not always know how to answer. But they repeated observations they had heard from sailors, farmers, and elders. It was enough. The habit of wondering grew across generations. On quiet nights, a person might sit on a flat rock near the sea and notice, perhaps for the very first time. The world changes, yet some things do not change. This feeling did not yet form into philosophy. It remained a sensation, a gentle intuition. Still, that intuition mattered. It created a crack, small, subtle, through which new forms of thought could enter. And in Miletus, That crack widened slowly, like sunlight spreading across the sea in early morning. The sky shifted through morning, afternoon, and night. They saw how shadows lengthened predictably. They saw how stars followed gentle arcs. They saw how animals behaved according to cycles unseen by humans. These shepherds did not write poetry or philosophy. They simply lived in a world where noticing was part of survival. And through noticing, thought deepened. One shepherd might remark, "The same star that rises before dawn now sets at a different point than it did months ago." Another might note, "This hill warms earlier in the year than that hill." These remarks built familiarity with the idea that the world's rhythms were not arbitrary, they were knowable, even if only through patient observation. In larger towns like Smyrna or Clazomene, markets produced another kind of noticing. Goods from different regions demonstrated that nature varied, clay colors differed, grains felt distinct, woods carried different scents and strengths. Craftspeople, comparing these materials, developed an intuitive sense of natural diversity and, beneath that diversity, possible unity. For example, a carpenter might say, "This wood bends before it breaks, while that wood breaks before it bends." This was not philosophy, but it hinted at a world structured by laws of behavior rather than divine whims. Travel also played a role. Greek sailors ventured far, navigating islands and coastlines while following stars whose movements they charted not in writing but in memory. They learned that certain constellations appeared in specific seasons and that particular winds matched these appearances. When they returned home, they brought back stories, small fragments of knowledge from other lands. Stories about different customs, different building methods, different soils, different crops. Such fragments created a broader context in which early thinkers began to situate their reflections. If different regions behaved differently, yet still followed predictable patterns, then perhaps the world as a whole had a quiet logic beneath its variety. Meanwhile, the poets, many of whom recited verses in marketplaces or at festivals, offered older explanations wrapped in myth. These poetic accounts were still deeply respected. They spoke of gods who shaped the world, of forces personified in wind, sun, and sea. But even as people listened, a parallel understanding formed. They began to wonder whether the stories, though beautiful, were symbolic rather than literal. Not rejected, just reinterpreted. Not replaced, simply complemented by the growing sense that nature behaved consistently. This complementing was crucial. Philosophy did not come into the Greek world as rebellion. It came as a soft addition, a new way of seeing that coexisted gently with familiar stories. Across these communities, individuals began thinking in terms of causes, why something happened, not just who caused it. A pot cracked because of uneven heat. A storm came because of a particular wind. A plant died because the soil lacked moisture. These realizations did not shake the foundations of society. They settled into daily routines as quiet understandings. In some places, thinkers began to propose simple models. Perhaps everything was ultimately made of one substance. Perhaps the world had a hidden order. Perhaps the divine was not separate from the world but present in its structure. Yet these ideas were not discussed urgently. They developed slowly, like paths worn by many footsteps across many years. A group of friends might sit on a hillside at dusk, watching the sea darken below. Someone might say, "What if the world is guided not by unpredictable actions, but by something constant?" Another might respond, "Then what is that constant?" No one would demand an immediate answer. The conversation would drift into silence, broken only by the sound of waves or distant animal calls. In such moments, thought deepened not through argument, but through stillness. These quiet exchanges, happening across the Greek world in countless variations, formed the earliest fabric of philosophical thinking. They shaped a new attitude, one that valued explanation over story, pattern over event, observation over assumption. Yet philosophy was not born fully formed here. It was still emerging, still unrecognized, still without name or structure. It existed as a tendency, a slow leaning toward rational understanding. And like dawn spreading across land and water, this leaning advanced softly, gently, without ever announcing itself. But from countless small observations. The presence of moisture in seeds. The softening of earth after rain. The steam rising from heated pots. The way rivers shaped land. The necessity of water for life. To him, the world felt fluid, not in appearance, but in its transformations. He never insisted he was correct. He simply noticed. And he shared those observations with others in gentle conversation, often while walking through the marketplace or sitting beneath an olive tree outside the city walls. In those exchanges, a young listener sometimes accompanied him. A thoughtful citizen named Anaximander. Anaximander shared Thales' inclination to observe, but he also sensed that water alone could not explain everything. If all things came from water, he wondered, what caused water itself to exist? And why did opposite qualities, such as heat and cold, wet and dry, emerge from something as uniform as water? He began to think, slowly and without grand declaration, about something more abstract, a boundless, undefined origin he called the apeiron, not a specific substance but a limitless source from which all things arise and into which they return. This idea did not disturb anyone. It was spoken softly, more as a reflection than a doctrine. Anaximander also turned his attention toward the shape of the world. During long afternoons in shaded courtyards, he traced crude outlines of coastlines in the dust with a stick, recalling what sailors described during their travels. Over time, these outlines became more detailed. He added islands, distances, approximate positions. Slowly, the first Greek map began to emerge, not with precision, but with quiet curiosity. At night, Anaximander watched the stars, noting how some circled the sky while others rose and set. He observed that shadows cast by vertical sticks shortened and lengthened with the seasons. Though he did not yet formalize his thoughts, he sensed that the earth might not be anchored by pillars or divine supports. Instead, he believed it remained suspended because it had no reason to move in one direction more than another. This idea, spoken in the softest tone, carried a quiet radicalism. But it was not met with resistance. People simply listened, nodded, and returned to their tasks. Nearby, another thinker named Anaximenes, younger than the others, began considering air as the fundamental substance. He felt that air filled the spaces between things, that breath gave life movement, and that by thickening or thinning, air transformed into clouds, water, or even stone. Walking along the hills near Miletus, he felt wind against his face and observed how it shifted. In workshops, he watched how air fed flames. He noticed how breath warmed cold hands and cooled hot soup when exhaled gently. These small experiences shaped his reflections. His thoughts were not lofty. They were grounded in daily life. Together, these early thinkers formed a small circle, a circle held not by formal meetings or declared membership, but by shared attention. They walked along the same harbor paths. They sat beneath the same sky. They watched the sea in its countless moods. They trusted that beneath the changing world lived something steady, something knowable. Their conversations were unhurried. A single idea might linger for days before anyone returned to it. A remark made in the morning might drift into silence until someone quietly revisited it at dusk. There were no debates. No assertions of superiority. No fixed doctrines. It was a kind of thinking born directly from the pace of life, slow, patient, Careful, always returning to the world for confirmation rather than to texts or authority. And in this atmosphere, the very nature of explanation changed. People began looking not for stories of gods but for processes, patterns, and causes. Not loudly, not defiantly, just quietly, like a tide rising without being noticed until it has already reshaped the shore. Hills, workshops, winds, and the gradual turn toward natural causes. While early thinkers in Miletus and neighboring regions shaped ideas in conversation, the broader Greek world continued its daily life, workshops humming softly, hills dotted with grazing animals, harbors echoing with the faint calls of sailors guiding boats to shore. Within this quiet, ordinary world, a shift deepened. Curiosity began rooting itself in nature rather than in myth. This shift was subtle, happening not through sudden realizations, but through countless small experiences that encouraged people to see the world as a place governed by consistent processes. In a potter's workshop, clay behaved predictably. When wet, it softened. When dry, it cracked. When heated, it hardened. This consistency invited speculation. If clay followed rules, perhaps everything else did, too. In a metalworker's forge, ores glowed, melted, cooled, and solidified according to their own patterns. The metalworker did not think of this as philosophy, but a visiting thinker might watch the entire process and ask, does fire draw forms out of matter, or does matter carry its own forms inside itself? Such questions floated through workshops like drifting smoke, visible for a moment, then dissolving. In the hills, shepherds noticed that the same plants appeared in the same seasons, that pastures dried in predictable rhythms, that streams swelled after particular rains. These observations were mundane, but to those inclined toward reflection, they formed a soft chorus of evidence. Nature moved according to patterns. Even wind began to feel more like a process than a spirit. Sailors could predict its arrival. Farmers knew which winds cooled fields and which winds dried soil. Children recognized winds associated with winter or summer long before they could define a calendar. As these recognitions took shape, thinkers like Anaximenes found support for the idea that air, constantly moving, constantly shifting, was not only life-giving but transformational. A compressed breath felt warm. An expanded breath felt cool. Clouds formed from vapor. Rain fell when clouds thickened. Dust rose when air moved swiftly across ground. Nothing about this required divine intervention, it was the quiet physics of everyday life. Meanwhile, Anaximander's map-making expanded. He revised coastlines after listening to sailors' accounts. He marked mountains where travelers described steep paths. He drew rough shapes of neighboring lands, giving form to a world previously imagined only through stories. His map did not claim accuracy. It claimed attention, the willingness to represent the world not through myth but through observation. Equally important was his growing sense that the cosmos itself might follow order. Watching the stars, he noticed that certain constellations moved along predictable arcs. Watching shadows, he noticed how their lengths changed. Watching seasons, he sensed that the world was not held together by chance, but by quiet rules. He never called these rules laws. He simply lived inside them. People throughout the region began noticing the same patterns. A merchant waiting for favorable winds realized that the sea, too, followed cycles. A farmer preparing fields recognized that soil responded to moisture in measurable ways. A builder constructing a temple noticed that columns carried weight differently depending on proportion. These were not formal studies. They were everyday experiences that gently encouraged a new way of interpreting the world. In the evenings, as lamps glowed in workshops and courtyards, conversations returned to these observations. Someone might say, everything seems to change, yet change follows patterns. Another might add, perhaps the gods act through order. Philosophy did not challenge the divine, it reimagined the divine as structure, not spontaneity. Across hills and islands, early thinkers continued observing. Some walked alone through olive groves, feeling the ground shift beneath their feet and noticing how roots grasped the soil. Some watched waves breaking in regular intervals, feeling the rhythm more than hearing it. Some climbed hills to watch sunsets, tracking the slow movement of seasons through the sun's position on the horizon. They carried questions with them, but not as burdens. These questions were companions, light, unassuming, always waiting patiently. What is the world made of? What causes change? What remains the same beneath all differences? These questions were not asked to be solved. They were asked to be lived with. And through this living, the early Greeks began shaping something entirely new. A worldview in which nature itself could be understood through reason, not the sharp, argumentative reason of later centuries, but a soft, observational reason grounded in attention and wonder. Philosophy, in this stage, was not a discipline. It was a mood, a way of looking, a slow attunement to the quiet laws that shaped the world. And as the sun set on workshops, harbors, hills, and homes, the gentle murmurs of these early reflections drifted through the Greek world like a faint breeze, present everywhere, changing nothing immediately, yet preparing everything for the deeper examination still to come. Thoughts detached themselves from immediate needs, drifting toward questions not born of necessity but of curiosity. What lies beneath all this changing motion? What causes the world to behave so reliably? Is there something constant beneath everything we see? At first, such questions were not answered with theories. They were answered with silence. A silence that allowed ideas to settle slowly, like fine sand drifting to the sea floor. Travel also nurtured reflection. Sailors navigating between islands spent long nights on quiet decks, steering by stars that rose and set with gentle precision. The more they watched, the more they sensed that the sky was not chaotic, it possessed structure. Certain stars always returned to the same positions. Certain winds arose at familiar times. Certain phases of the moon matched particular tides. These rhythms were not stories of divine temper. They were hints of underlying order. Trade brought even more opportunities for comparison. Merchants returning from eastern or northern lands described mountains, rivers, customs, and weather patterns that differed from those at home. The differences were interesting, but the similarities were more striking, the repeated behaviors of nature across distant regions. Water always flowed downward. Fire always rose. Seasons cycled reliably. These observations softened mythic explanations into something calmer. People still believed in gods, but many began imagining that the gods acted through consistent processes rather than unpredictable interventions. The earliest thinkers, like Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes, absorbed these influences deeply. But they were not unique in attention, they were simply more persistent in their noticing. Still, their reflections began spreading across the Aegean world in subtle ways. A shepherd listening to a traveling merchant might repeat a quiet remark to his neighbor. A potter noticing a change in clay after firing might wonder softly whether heat itself held deeper properties. A fisherman steering by the North Star might ask why that star moved so little while others drifted across the sky. These small questions created the early fabric of abstract thought. No one named this shift. There were no declarations of a new era. But slowly, communities began recognizing that the world could be approached not only through stories but also through principles. Principles were softer than laws, less rigid, more like tendencies. Ways in which nature behaved with enough consistency to encourage contemplation. The thinkers of this period did not argue about these principles, they explored them the way one explores a quiet garden, walking slowly, noticing each new plant, each new patch of shade. For example, Thales's idea that water was the origin of all things invited others to consider what qualities made something fundamental. Anaximander's notion of the apeiron invited reflections about what was infinite or indefinite. Anaximenes' emphasis on air encouraged discussions about breath, life, and transformation. None of these concepts were finalized. They were beginnings, soft openings, invitations to think. And the world in which these early figures lived supported such beginnings. There were no academies, no formal teachers, no authorities claiming ownership of knowledge. Ideas drifted freely, carried by conversation, travel, craftsmanship, and daily work. A potter shaping clay understood the idea of transformation. A farmer tending fields understood cycles. A sailor navigating winds understood invisible forces. A carpenter shaping beams understood strength, tension, and balance. In many ways, philosophy formed not in isolation but within the shared experiences of ordinary life. People recognized that certain things changed while others endured. They sensed that some processes were predictable while others were not. They noticed that change itself followed patterns. And from these realizations, abstract thought began forming like early morning mist, subtle, delicate, and almost invisible, yet undeniably present. Nothing about this process was sudden. Philosophy did not burst into existence. It arrived quietly, moving slowly through minds accustomed to patience. In the hills, in ports, in marketplaces, in workshops, people began speaking not only of what happened but of why and how. Their questions did not seek resolution, they sought deeper connection with the world. And as these inquiries accumulated, they created the earliest framework of philosophical thought, a framework built not on certainty, but on openness, curiosity, and attention. Water fell in soft, repeating sounds. Conversation flowed gently. No one interrupted. No one demanded proof. Ideas were offered lightly, like pebbles placed on the ground for others to consider. Over time, some of these circles became known as places where certain kinds of thinking occurred. But they did not have names, leaders, or membership. Instead, they shared something far quieter, a common manner of wondering. The Milesian Circle, though not formally called that, formed around the gentle guidance of Thales and his companions. Travelers visiting Miletus might overhear discussions about the nature of change, the movement of stars, or the form of the earth. These visitors carried the conversations with them to other parts of the Greek world. In Ephesus, a different tone emerged, a tone shaped by people who noticed not only regularities in nature but also the constant tension between opposites. Warm becomes cold. Dry becomes wet. Stillness becomes motion. Such observations led to reflections about how change itself was the foundation of existence. Later, thinkers like Heraclitus would be associated with these ideas. But at this early stage, they existed simply as shared reflections repeated during quiet evenings. In other towns, attention turned toward numbers. Not sophisticated mathematics, but simple relationships. The ratio of beam lengths in construction. The spacing of columns in temples. The pattern of notes in simple instruments. As these observations accumulated, some people began sensing that harmony was not just a quality of music but a signature of the world, an indication that order existed within apparent disorder. In this way, different regions contributed their own tone to early philosophy. Miletus with its focus on substance and origin. Ephesus with its focus on change. Ionian towns with their attention to observation. Island communities with their sense of pattern and proportion. No one called these differences schools. No one claimed authority. Ideas simply traveled like soft waves, spreading outward without force. A craftsperson visiting Miletus might return home repeating a small idea they heard while repairing a sail. A trader passing through Ephesus might share a remark about opposites in balance. A musician practicing simple intervals might wonder whether numbers govern more than just sound. These movements were subtle, but they created something new in Greek life. A culture of thinking. Slowly shared, quietly absorbed, gently expanded. Even temples played a role. Not in their religious function, but in their sophisticated architecture. A visitor standing inside a colonnade might feel the balance of proportions and sense that beauty emerged from symmetry, not chance. This realization encouraged questions about what the world itself might look like if viewed through similar principles. Meanwhile, life in towns and villages continued at its steady pace. Donkeys carried loads along narrow streets. Women drew water from fountains. Weavers sat at their looms, repeating motions learned from generations before them. Farmers measured the passing seasons by the height of the sun and the feel of the wind. These everyday activities quietly reinforced the idea that the world was structured. Not chaotic, not random, but ordered in ways that could be understood through calm observation. As thinkers reflected on these patterns, they developed early forms of explanation. Not dramatic theories, but gentle proposals. Perhaps everything returns to its opposite. Perhaps the world rests on balance. Perhaps nature seeks harmony. Perhaps diversity arises from unity. These proposals did not need to be correct. Their value lay in the contemplative process they encouraged. In this era, the boundary between philosophy, craft, and daily life was thin. A potter thinking about clay might inspire a theorist thinking about matter. A sailor thinking about winds might inspire a thinker considering change. A musician experimenting with intervals might influence someone contemplating cosmic order. The Greek world was becoming a landscape of ideas. Not a loud landscape. Not a competitive landscape. But a softly connected one. People everywhere carried small fragments of thought. And as they shared these fragments across generations, the collective understanding of the world expanded, slowly, steadily, peacefully. Philosophy was beginning to take shape. Not through force, but through the patient accumulation of gentle questions. Relationships began to wonder. If sounds follow patterns, what else might follow them? If buildings feel stable at certain proportions, does the world itself have proportion? If harmony exists in music, could harmony exist in nature? These questions drifted widely, carried across workshops, markets, and ports. Travelers carried them from one island to another, from one coast to the next. Thoughts moved slowly, but they accumulated like sand forming a new shoreline. Into this environment stepped a figure whose name would later become famous, Pythagoras. But in this early period, he was not a sage or a mathematician surrounded by followers. He was simply a traveler, moving from land to land, learning from artisans, musicians, sailors, builders, and priests. Pythagoras listened more than he spoke. He observed more than he instructed. He was welcomed into workshops where wooden lyres were carved and strings stretched across frames. He watched how craftspeople measured lengths with cords, tapping gently to test sound. He listened as they explained that some tones felt right, while others felt unstable or unsettled. He walked along harbors where sailors sang rhythmic chants to coordinate the movement of oars, noticing how the rhythm unified physical effort. He visited markets where metalworkers struck stones and metals, producing resonant tones that varied by size and thickness. He traveled alongside traders who described the architecture of distant lands, buildings whose columns created pleasing impressions not by accident but through proportion. In each instance, Pythagoras sensed something subtle. The world behaved according to relationships, ratios, proportions, balances, not random events. This realization was not sudden. It grew slowly, like dawn light brightening a room from the edges inward. He began thinking that numbers were not merely tools for counting goats or measuring grain. Numbers might be principles, quiet regulators behind phenomena that appeared unrelated. He contemplated how strings produced harmonic notes at lengths that corresponded to simple numbers. He contemplated how builders aligned columns to achieve symmetry. He contemplated how seasons followed cycles, each cycle divisible into smaller, recurring portions. He contemplated how travelers used consistent angles of stars to navigate across wide waters. In conversations, he did not assert grand theories. He spoke gently. Perhaps things are arranged according to number. Perhaps harmony is not only in music but in the structure of the world. Listeners absorbed the ideas without urgency. They returned to their tasks. But the seed remained. Meanwhile, Pythagoras continued traveling. He visited lands where rivers flooded predictably. He observed the shadows cast by tall structures at different times of the year. He listened to local stories but also watched how time shaped human habits. When he eventually returned to the Greek world, he brought not dogma but perspective, the idea that beneath the diversity of experience lay an invisible order. He settled temporarily in places where workshops hummed softly, and he spent evenings in quiet courtyards speaking with individuals who shared the habit of watching the world patiently. His reflections blended seamlessly into the culture of slow curiosity developing across the region. It would be many years before structured mathematical philosophy emerged. For now, the contributions of Pythagoras and others were like stones placed gently along a path, not yet forming a road, but pointing toward one. Through these stones, people across the Greek world began sensing that music, architecture, movement, and nature were not separate, but parts of the same quiet pattern. And as the pattern grew clearer, philosophy, still unnamed, still unfolding, gained new depth. It became not just the search for origins or the analysis of change, but the contemplation of structure, form, relationship, and measure. Not loudly, not through proclamations, but through the soft, accumulating realization that the world resonated with harmony. A merchant might return from a distant island speaking of a thinker who believed that everything came from air. A sailor might mention someone who claimed the earth floated freely in space without need for support. A potter might recall hearing a traveler say that opposites governed the world. A musician might speak of someone who believed that numbers held quiet power. These remarks did not transform communities overnight. They drifted into the fabric of daily life, becoming points of reflection during work, travel, or rest. The Greek world was uniquely suited to this flow. Its islands and coastal towns were close enough for travel, yet far enough apart that each place developed its own perspective. Hills and mountains created natural separations, while the sea created natural connections. In Ionian coastal towns, workshops buzzed gently with artisans perfecting techniques inherited from generations before them. Builders refined architectural proportions. Potters experimented with shapes that balanced aesthetic beauty and stability. Metalworkers adjusted heating techniques based on color and glow. These activities reinforced an idea emerging everywhere. The world revealed itself through patient attention to its patterns. In inland regions, shepherds and farmers observed cycles of seasons, migrations of birds, and rhythms of crops. They knew the land intimately through slow experience, not through deliberate study. Their knowledge gave philosophers raw material, observations of constancy amid change. In island communities, musicians explored scale patterns, builders refined geometric layouts, and sailors tracked star paths. These practices deepened the sense that the world operated according to relationships. As people traveled between these regions, whether to trade wool, goats, copper, wine, or pottery, ideas traveled with them. Not in scrolls, but in memory. Not in argument, but in anecdote. Small phrases were repeated again and again. Some say the earth floats. Some say everything is air. Some say all things are in constant motion. Some say harmony guides the world. These phrases were not taken as truth. They were taken as contemplations, gentle invitations to consider different ways of seeing. Over time, communities across the Greek world became comfortable with a new kind of understanding. That explanations could exist without myth. That nature could hold its own order. That the mind could approach that order slowly and without fear. In this era, thought did not divide people. It connected them across distances. Shared curiosity became a quiet bond. Travelers meeting in harbors spoke of constellations, winds, materials, or stories they had heard in other lands. Pilgrims visiting temples exchanged insights about rituals and the meanings behind them. Craftspeople comparing techniques discovered that the principles of balance, symmetry, and harmony transcended local customs. In the evenings, towns glowed softly with lamplight. People gathered outside their homes. Dogs curled at the edges of courtyards. Wine was poured slowly. The air cooled. And someone, perhaps without even intending to, asked a question that brought the entire day into focus. What do you think guides all things? No one rushed to answer. Someone might suggest a substance, water, air, fire, or something boundless. Someone else might speak of opposites in balance. Another might mention harmony or proportion. And another might sit quietly, not speaking at all, but thinking deeply. There was no need to resolve the question. The value lay in its asking. Through such exchanges, philosophy expanded. Not through precision, not through hierarchy, but through the accumulation of countless gentle reflections. And the Greek world, without fully realizing it, was preparing for thinkers who would later give voice to more structured ideas: Heraclitus, Parmenides, Empedocles, Pythagoreans, and others, each building upon the soft groundwork laid by generations before them. The stage was set, not through drama, but through stillness. Through the quiet birth of thought. Through the patient noticing of patterns. Through the subtle sharing of reflections. And through the simple fact that, across coasts, hills, and islands, people continue to look at the world and wonder softly. What is it, truly, that we live inside? Hills and shifting waterways. Here, the world did not feel still. It felt alive with slow, continuous alteration. The river near Ephesus changed with the seasons. It widened and narrowed, deepened and shallowed, shifted its banks, and carved new channels. People living along its edges sensed this rhythm intimately. They saw sandbars forming in one year and disappearing the next. They watched reeds migrate in gentle arcs. They felt ground harden and soften depending on rainfall. These were not dramatic events. They were subtle, gradual movements, the kind noticed by shepherds, farmers, and travelers walking the same path day after day. Among those who watched most closely was a quiet, introspective figure later remembered as Heraclitus. But at this early moment, he was simply a person who preferred solitude, riverbanks, and long walks through wooded hills more than the company of markets or festivals. He did not speak often. When he did, his remarks were short, reflective, and sometimes cryptic, but always rooted in careful observation of how the world behaved. Watching the river one morning, he noticed how the water was never the same from moment to moment. Returning the next day, he saw the river had shifted slightly, its sound softer, its depth different, its current slower. To him, this indicated not chaos but a deeper principle. Everything flows. Everything moves. Nothing remains as it was. He did not use those exact words in this early period. Rather, he repeated simpler phrases. Change is constant. What rises, falls. What falls, rises. Cold becomes warm. Warm becomes cold. The path up and the path down are the same. These remarks drifted into conversations the way a breeze enters a courtyard, quietly, barely noticed, yet felt. People who worked with natural processes understood his reflections instinctively. A metalworker hammering glowing iron knew that heat and cold alternated rhythmically. A potter shaping clay saw how softness became firmness through fire. Farmers observed seasons of growth and decay. Shepherds watched lambs grow, landscapes change, and weather shift continuously. But Heraclitus sensed something more profound, that change itself was not simply something that happened, it was the nature of reality. He found patterns in opposites. Day turned into night, and night into day. Summer became winter, winter returned to summer. Wetlands dried into fields, fields flooded into wetlands. Lives were born, grew, and faded, only to nourish new life. Nothing stayed fixed, yet the process remained stable. Even fire, a common sight in kitchens, workshops, and hearths, held meaning for him. Fire transformed everything it touched. It consumed wood, clay, metal, and even air, yet it never stayed as one thing. It was always becoming something else. Fire's transformative nature reflected his deepest intuition. The world is a process, not a product. He did not present his reflections as commandments. He shared them softly, almost absent-mindedly, often when someone else spoke of a situation as permanent. Heraclitus responded simply, "It will change." People nodded. Some pondered the remark for hours. Others returned to their tasks. Heraclitus also sensed a harmony beneath these shifts, not a musical harmony like the Pythagoreans described, but a harmony of tension, of contrasts pulling against one another in balanced opposition. "The bow works because it is stretched," he once murmured. "The lyre sings because its strings are pulled tight." To him, opposites did not conflict, they completed one another. This insight did not form a school. It formed a mood, a way of attending to the world that found meaning not in stability but in the patterns of becoming. His reflection spread slowly, carried by those who found his way of observing comforting rather than unsettling. After all, if change was the world's natural rhythm, then one could move through life with acceptance rather than resistance. In this way, Heraclitus quieted fears not through reassurance but through perspective. People realized. Life grows, fades, and grows again, not because of punishment or reward, but because this is the nature of the world. This understanding attracted those who spent long hours alone, shepherds on hillsides, fishermen waiting for tides, artisans who repeated the same gestures thousands of times. Their quiet observations aligned with Heraclitus's simple truth. The world was not static. It was a flowing pattern. And to understand the world meant to understand its changing nature. This was not yet formal philosophy. It was lived philosophy, woven naturally into daily routines. And it would, slowly and gently, prepare minds for deeper contemplation still to come. A stable truth. This search emerged from everyday life as much as Heraclitus's reflections did. Farmers noticed that although each season differed, the cycle itself remained stable. Builders knew that structures stood firm only when their foundations were steady. Sailors relied on stars that returned to the same places at the same times every year. Craftspeople discovered that materials behaved consistently despite variation in appearance. In some minds, these experiences suggested that the world must rest upon something fixed. Not the fixed objects of daily life, but something deeper. People began discussing these ideas quietly in courtyards, on hillsides, and during long walks between towns. Slowly, a new intuition formed. If everything changes, what is it that is? Some thinkers proposed that the world must consist of elements more permanent than the forms they created. They spoke of earth, air, fire, and water not as gods, but as stable essences beneath shifting appearances. Others, inspired by Anaximander's reflections on the boundless, believed that the source of all things could not itself be a thing. It had to be something infinite, something without beginning or end, something that could generate opposites without possessing any specific form. People did not debate these ideas aggressively. They explored them with the patience of gardeners tending slow-growing vines. In cities like Clazomenae, citizens sat quietly near fountains, listening to water fall in steady intervals. Some suggested that the world must have a hidden order, not visible to the senses but grasped through reflection. In workshops across Ionia, artisans tested materials repeatedly, noticing that underlying behaviors persisted even when appearances shifted. Their practical understanding influenced theoretical thought. Stability beneath change seemed not only plausible but necessary. Among these reflections arose gentle conceptual distinctions. Appearance versus reality. Change versus permanence. Becoming versus being. These distinctions did not yet have formal names, but they shaped how people approached questions about the world. A few thinkers began leaning toward the idea that the senses could mislead. Just because something appeared to change did not mean that change was fundamental. Perhaps the senses captured only surface-level shifts, while the mind could grasp a deeper unity. This idea resonated with those who spent long hours working with materials. A potter saw clay transform in fire, but knew the substance remained clay before and after. A carpenter carved wood into beams, but knew the wood itself was still wood. A weaver turned wool into fabric, yet understood that the wool was unchanged in essence. If substances persisted even through transformation, maybe the world itself had an underlying identity. A quiet tension formed between the perspectives of change and permanence. But this tension did not cause conflict. It became fertile ground for reflection. Some leaned toward Heraclitus's insight. The world is change. Others leaned toward the ideas soon to be associated with Parmenides. The world is being. But no one yet felt a need to decide between them. Both perspectives seemed true in daily life. Rivers changed, land persisted. Children grew, humanity remained. Seasons shifted, cycles endured. Thought unfolded like a river flowing across stable ground, movement resting upon structure. This harmony between change and permanence reflected not only intellectual balance but emotional calm. People found comfort in the idea that although life altered continuously, something deeper held everything in place. This comfort shaped the earliest Greek metaphysics not by argument but by lived experience. By this time, philosophy, though still unnamed, had spread widely. People in distant villages spoke casually of origins, principles, and patterns. Travelers exchanged remarks about the nature of things. Artisans considered the properties of materials more carefully. Shepherds watching stars sensed a deeper unity. And everywhere, people moved slowly toward a shared intuition. That beneath the shifting world lay something steady. Not a fixed object, not a personified deity, but a principle that revealed itself quietly through the world's own behavior. This intuition did not close questions. It opened more of them. What is the origin of all things? What is the nature of being? How do things come to be? Why does change occur? What connects all things in the world? No one hurried to answer. The value remained in contemplating the questions themselves. And thus, the Greek world entered a new stage of its intellectual journey. Still slow, still gentle, still rooted in observation and calm reflection. But now reaching toward ideas more abstract than ever before. Its changes, oppositions, harmonies, another shape of thought began forming far from the bustling markets and coastal harbors. It emerged inland, in quiet regions where open plains stretched toward distant horizons and where long roads allowed travelers to walk for hours without encountering another voice. Here lived Parmenides, a thinker whose reflections drifted in a direction nearly opposite to that of Heraclitus. But in this early period, he was not yet the figure whose ideas would echo across centuries. He was simply a quiet, observant man who preferred isolation, who walked long distances in silence, and whose thinking unfolded slowly over wide landscapes. Parmenides lived in a community where tradition held strong. Rituals marked the seasons, temples lined roads, and elders recited hymns that had been repeated for generations. Life here did not have the constant motion of coastal towns. The days were calm. The nights were still. Time itself felt slower. Walking on these plains, where the horizon remained unbroken, Parmenides felt something unusual, a sense of stability, unlike the ever-shifting world described by Heraclitus. The earth beneath his feet did not move. The sky, though changing in color, retained its shape. Even winds felt less dramatic here, softer, steadier. He began to wonder, what is it that truly exists? What remains the same beneath everything we perceive? Is change real, or merely an appearance? These were not confrontational questions. They were meditative, emerging from long hours of solitude. Parmenides noticed how experiences deceived the senses. A distant object appeared small, yet grew larger when approached. Straight roads looked curved on the horizon. The same land felt cool at dawn and warm at midday. Water looked shallow and clear from above but deep and murky when entered. From these quiet observations, he slowly formed a thought that few around him had considered. Perhaps the senses do not show the truth. Perhaps reality lay not in the world of appearances but in something deeper, something accessible only to reason. Sitting alone beside low stone walls or resting beneath olive trees heavy with age, Parmenides allowed his thoughts to settle, to clarify, to simplify. Bit by bit, he reached a conclusion so stark, so gentle, yet so profound that it would eventually reshape generations of thought. What truly is, cannot change. What changes, cannot truly be. In this early phase, he expressed this not as doctrine but as quiet reflection. What exists, exists. What does not, cannot be spoken of. The simplicity of these remarks made them easy to remember. And so they drifted through his community, carried by listeners who repeated them in their own calm voices during evening gatherings or morning walks. People found the idea strangely comforting. Change could feel unsettling, storms, loss, sickness, aging. But Parmenides offered a perspective where beneath the shifting surface of life there existed something permanent, unshaken, untouched by time. He did not specify what that something was. He only insisted that whatever truly exists must be ungenerated, indestructible, whole, continuous, unchanging. To him, the world of becoming, growth, decay, movement was merely a realm of appearances. The true world lay behind all this, still and eternal. This idea settled softly onto the minds of those who heard it. It was not a demand. It was an invitation to look past the surface of things. Even people who did not fully grasp Parmenides' meaning found calm in the thought that change might not rule everything. Farmers spoke of the underlying stability of the land. Mothers felt comfort knowing that life, though fragile, returned in cycles. Elders recognized in Parmenides' words a deeper way of understanding the passing of time. Meanwhile, Parmenides walked the same routes day after day. He traced familiar paths, knowing each stone yet experiencing each step as part of a greater stillness. To him, motion was not the essence of reality, it was a surface ripple upon something unmoving. He did not hope to convince everyone. He simply hoped to share a way of thinking that aligned with the profound sense of stability he felt beneath the world's changing face. And slowly, gently, his ideas began to spread. Not loudly, not widely at first, but through quiet conversations, meditative reflections, and the calm words of those who found in his thought a sense of grounding. The Greek world was beginning to hold two visions at once. Heraclitus, all is change. Parmenides, all is being. Neither vision sought to defeat the other. Together, they shaped a landscape of thought deeper than anything that had come before. But some still felt anchored to the world of appearances. To motion, change, growth, decay. So Zeno crafted gentle puzzles, paradoxes, not to confuse or disrupt, but to guide thought away from sensory impressions and toward deeper reflection. One evening, while sitting with neighbors who had gathered after a long day, he suggested a simple idea. If a traveler must reach a destination, he said softly, he must first reach the halfway point. And before that, the half of the half. And before that, the half of that. So motion appears impossible, because one must complete infinitely many steps. He did not raise his voice. He did not demand agreement. He simply let the idea rest in the air. People were accustomed to walking long distances across the plains, so the paradox did not alarm them. It intrigued them. They considered the idea silently, watching the sun dim on stone walls, the shadows lengthen gradually. The paradox did not claim motion was impossible. It suggested that the way we understand motion may not capture its true nature. Over weeks and months, Zeno introduced other gentle puzzles. A swift runner cannot overtake a slower runner if he must always reach the point where the slower runner has just been. A flying arrow appears motionless if every moment freezes it in place. Two lines moving in opposite directions seem to behave differently from intuition. These puzzles were not intended as strict arguments. They were contemplations. Each paradox was like a smooth pebble placed in the palm, something small, simple, yet capable of drawing long attention. People in Zeno's community often encountered these paradoxes not in formal settings but in everyday contexts. During rests on long walks, while waiting for water at a public fountain, while sitting under shade on warm afternoons. They felt no urgency to solve the puzzles. The puzzles were companions, not challenges. A shepherd listening to Zeno might ponder the motion of flocks across fields, or the illusion of speed created when clouds drifted overhead. A potter might consider how clay appeared still while turning on a wheel. A carpenter might think about how the eye misjudged distances when beams aligned at angles. Zeno's paradoxes spread slowly beyond his homeland, carried by travelers who remembered them as curious reflections. They repeated them in distant towns, where people responded with soft laughter or quiet thought. The paradoxes created a space for reflection. A space where familiar assumptions loosened. Where appearances were questioned gently. Where deeper possibilities emerged. At this stage, Zeno and Parmenides were not seen as founders of a school. They were seen as thoughtful individuals whose ideas invited a calm reconsideration of everyday experiences. Their community became known, very gradually, as a place where people took time to reflect, where evenings were filled not only with stories and rituals but with quiet questions about what truly exists, what the senses reveal, and what the mind can grasp. This slow intellectual culture did something remarkable. It made abstract thought feel natural. People did not resist philosophy. They drifted into it, the way one drifts into a warm bath or a slow conversation. They accepted that understanding the world required attention, not agitation, patience, not force. As Parmenides reflected on being, and Heraclitus on becoming, and Pythagoreans on harmony, and Milesians on substance, the Greek world became a tapestry woven from different strands of thought. Each gentle, each patient, each contributing to a view of the world where nature, mind, and existence intertwined softly. Philosophy was no longer only about what things were made of. It became about what it meant to exist, what it meant to change, what it meant to perceive. And the world, once explained through myth alone, now appeared rich with deeper structures. Not replacing myth, but offering another way to rest inside reality. The foundations of Western thought were forming. Not in noise, not in conflict, but in the slow, calm reflections of communities willing to sit with the world and quietly ask, what is true beneath all that appears? Weave earlier reflections into a gentle structure. This approach emerged most clearly in the mind of Empedocles, a figure remembered later for bold imagery and poetic thought, yet whose earliest reflections grew from quiet observation of everyday life. Empedocles lived in a region where land and sea met in gentle balance. Hills rose softly, fields stretched wide, and small streams threaded between village paths. People there relied on farming, herding, and simple craftsmanship. They lived close to the soil, the air, the water, and the warmth of the sun. Empedocles spent long hours outdoors, watching how these natural elements interacted. He noticed how soil held seeds, how water nourished them, how air encircled their growth, and how sunlight gave them warmth. Nothing in this seemed mysterious, just the quiet cooperation of natural forces. But as Empedocles observed more deeply, he began sensing a gentle pattern. Perhaps the world is composed not of one substance but of several. Simple, enduring elements that combine and separate in countless ways. In his early reflections, he did not present a grand doctrine. He spoke lightly, often to neighbors who worked the land. Earth is firm, he would say softly. Water moves through all things. Air surrounds us. Fire warms and transforms. People understood him immediately, not because they grasped philosophy, but because they experienced these truths daily. Fire hardened clay. Water softened soil. Earth provided stability. Air brought breath and wind. Empedocles proposed that these four elements, earth, water, air, and fire, were eternal and unchanging. Yet the world they created was full of change. How could this be? Empedocles explained quietly. If elements mix, forms arise. If elements separate, forms fade. In this view, nothing was created from nothing, and nothing disappeared entirely. Everything was a rearrangement, a gentle shifting of the same eternal components. These ideas resonated with those who worked with physical materials. Potters who blended clays. Metalworkers who mixed ores. Farmers who combined soil, water, and sunlight to produce crops. They understood intuitively that forms were temporary but materials endured. But Empedocles went further, not dramatically, but calmly. He proposed that two forces guided the mixing and separating of elements. A unifying force and a separating force. He called them simply love, the gentle force that draws things together. Strife, the force that gently pulls things apart. These were not romantic or violent forces. They were metaphors for processes everyone saw around them. Plants growing and then withering. Families forming and fading. Communities rising and changing. Empedocles' neighbors listened quietly. His ideas felt natural, rooted in experience. He offered no challenge to tradition. He simply gave a new language for understanding the world. a language soft enough to settle into daily thought without resistance. As his ideas spread, people found comfort in them. If everything was made from the same eternal elements, then nothing was ever truly lost. Change became easier to accept. Death became less final. Life became part of a larger, gentle cycle. Empedocles did not unify Greek philosophy, but he created a bridge. A way to hold the tension between change and stability without conflict. Meanwhile, in distant towns and quiet valleys, others began forming reflections that complemented his, creating a slow merging of ideas that prepared the Greek world for new kinds of explanations. Midday heat. He noticed how materials contained hidden potentials. Seeds held trees within them. Stones contained minerals invisible to the eye. Food nourished bodies through processes no one could see. He realized that the world was not composed of simple elements alone, but of countless tiny substances mixed together, tiny portions of everything in everything. This idea emerged not from dramatic insight but from calm observation. The finer you grind grain, the more hidden textures reveal themselves. The deeper you look into stone, the more varied its colors become. The more carefully you examine soil, the more life you find. From this, Anaxagoras concluded, nothing exists as a single pure substance. Everything contains parts of everything else. But if this was true, why did forms appear distinct? Why did bread nourish, fire warm, water cool, stone remain firm? Anaxagoras sensed that the world must possess not only material mixture but also an ordering principle, something that arranged these mixtures into coherent forms. He called this principle nous, mind, or intellect. But his idea of mind was gentle, not personal or divine in a dramatic way. It was simply a quiet ordering force, a subtle motion that separated and arranged things with delicate precision. He described it softly. Mind is the finest and purest of all things. It knows all things. It moves all things. This was not a force of command. It was a force of quiet coordination. Neighbors listening to him did not imagine a cosmic ruler. They imagined something like the gentle intelligence of nature. The way seeds sprout predictably. The way stars move in steady arcs. The way the body heals. The way herds gather and disperse. The way birds migrate with the seasons. Anaxagoras believed that mind initiated motion, slowly separating mixtures so that forms emerged. Not instantly, not dramatically, but gradually. Like cream rising in milk. Like sediment settling in water. Like day emerging from night. His reflections gave people a new sense of order. The world felt less chaotic, less arbitrary. They saw themselves living within a quiet structure guided by gentle intelligence. As his ideas spread, travelers carried them into distant towns. People repeated his remarks while waiting at fountains or resting under colonnades. They considered the possibility that the world did not simply move, it moved with purpose, with direction, with calm intentionality. And yet, Anaxagoras did not claim to know this purpose. He merely sensed that the world's arrangement was too delicate to arise from random motion. The presence of nous reassured people that beneath complexity lay coherence. Beneath mixture lay order. Beneath appearance lay subtle structure. By this point, Greek thought had expanded gently but profoundly. Beginning with substance, moving through change, harmony, elements, and now mind, philosophy grew not by conflict but by accumulation, layer upon layer of insight resting calmly atop the previous one. Across the Greek world, people began thinking not only with their senses but with their minds. They questioned, considered, and reflected. Even those who never met a philosopher found themselves shaped by these ideas. Philosophy had gone from curiosity to habit. From habit to culture. from culture to quiet tradition. And the world, still the same mountains, seas, plains, and skies, felt deeper, richer, more connected. Each idea was a soft light illuminating a little more of the quiet order behind existence, which themselves came from finer fibers. Metalworkers hammered ingots into thin sheets, noticing how material could be extended again and again. From these experiences, some thinkers began wondering, is there a smallest piece, something that cannot be cut farther? Is there an end to division? Does matter have an ultimate unit? In early reflections, these questions remained soft and speculative. No one attempted experiments. They simply imagined the possibility that beneath all visible forms there existed tiny bits too small for the eye to perceive. Among those who considered these questions deeply were Leucippus and, later, Democritus, thinkers who did not seek fame or authority but who surrounded themselves with observations from everyday life. Leucippus, a quiet man whose exact origins remain uncertain, spent much of his time near workshops where materials were shaped, cut, mixed, and refined. He watched how flour dust dispersed in the air when sifted, how smoke separated into invisible streams, how liquid split into droplets and then rejoined. From these observations, he imagined a world composed of small, solid particles moving through empty space. He did not describe these particles forcefully. He spoke of them gently, as something that might explain why materials behaved predictably even when their visible forms changed. People listening to him did not feel threatened by the idea. They found it practical, even comforting. If matter consisted of tiny, enduring pieces, then transformation was simply rearrangement. A process much like what they saw in workshops every day. Later, Democritus, a curious and wide-traveling thinker, expanded these reflections. He visited distant lands, observing how different cultures understood nature. He watched clouds drift in layered motions, feeling how the wind's touch varied at different heights. He noticed how droplets formed on pottery cooled at dawn, how dust lifted from roads, how water separated into ripples when a pebble was thrown. Democritus believed that the world's diversity, every texture, color, flavor, sound, could be explained by differences in the shapes and arrangements of invisible particles. He spoke softly of smooth particles forming liquids, rough particles forming solids, hooked particles forming tougher materials, and fine particles drifting lightly through the air. He did not claim certainty. He simply described what seemed plausible from the countless small observations available to anyone who paid attention. What made his thought gentle, almost soothing, was the idea that these tiny particles moved endlessly through open space, not chaotic motion, but motion guided by natural tendencies. Collisions, separations, swirls, and gatherings created all visible forms, and when forms dissolved, the particles continued their motion elsewhere. This view resonated with those who found comfort in natural processes. A potter flattening clay saw particles aligning. A baker kneading dough imagined grains combining. A carpenter sanding would sense fine dust rising into the air. A shepherd watching smoke drift from a hillside fire imagined small bits dancing in sunlight. Democritus's idea also explained change without invoking divine causes. If particles were eternal, then nothing ever truly perished. Forms dissolved, but the particles endured, ready to create new forms. This made the world feel less tragic, less uncertain. Life's losses were softened by the understanding that nothing disappeared completely. Everything simply became something else. Democritus spoke of this with calm acceptance. He believed that understanding nature's quiet processes could bring peace. Not because it revealed ultimate meaning, but because it showed that the world operated with gentle consistency. He described the cosmos as infinite, not in a terrifying sense, but as a vast, spacious expanse in which particles drifted, gathered, and dispersed like dust moving through a long sunbeam. This image comforted those who heard it. It suggested that the world was neither fragile nor arbitrary, but stable in its foundations and ever-changing in its formations. By this stage, Greek philosophy had expanded into many directions: substance, change, being, harmony, elements, mixtures, and now atoms. Yet the diversity did not cause division. Each idea offered a different way to sit with existence. Quietly, thoughtfully, peacefully. And the world, still full of mountains, seas, plains, and stars, seemed to grow even more spacious as people contemplated the vastness beneath the smallest visible things. People began wondering not only what things were made of, but how far the world extended, how time unfolded, and whether existence had boundaries. These questions did not arise suddenly. They drifted into thought in the same way clouds drift across the sky, slowly, gently, shaped by the quiet forces of experience. Travelers moving between islands felt the openness of the sea. Sailors gazing at the horizon felt the world stretch far beyond sight. Shepherds watching stars sensed the repeating order of the heavens. Builders measuring long beams began understanding proportion on a larger scale. From these experiences, the idea of the infinite, once rare and abstract, began settling softly into Greek philosophy. Some thinkers imagined an infinite cosmos filled with countless worlds. Not out of boldness, but because the world they saw offered no clear boundaries. The sky did not end. The sea did not end. Time did not end. Democritus, influenced by Leucippus and his own experiences, suggested that infinite space contained infinite atoms forming infinite arrangements. But he did not present this idea with awe or fear. He offered it calmly, as a natural extension of the patterns observed around him. Others interpreted the infinite differently. Some believed that the world extended endlessly in all directions, with materials arranged in layered forms, denser near the earth, lighter near the heavens. Others imagined infinite cycles of creation and dissolution, each cycle reflecting the same quiet rhythms. Even those who stayed close to daily routines felt the influence of these reflections. A potter shaping circular vessels sensed the idea of endless continuity. A fisherman navigating by stars imagined celestial order extending far beyond what he could see. A weaver creating long, repeating patterns thought of time itself as a woven fabric. These contemplations began shifting Greek thought from the physical toward the abstract. People became interested not only in what things were made of, but in what kinds of ideas the mind could hold. They discovered that the mind's capacity was larger than any individual experience. Still, this movement toward the infinite did not disrupt the gentle pace of life. It unfolded alongside routine. Children learning letters. Farmers tending fields. Carpenters repairing tools. Sailors preparing ships. Philosophy had become a quiet backdrop to existence, a companion to daily tasks. As these abstract reflections grew, another subtle shift occurred. Different thinkers began acknowledging one another's insights, not to challenge, but to integrate. Heraclitus's vision of change complemented Parmenides' vision of being. Empedocles' elements aligned gently with Anaxagoras' mixtures. The atomists offered a physical interpretation that did not clash with earlier ideas but extended them. This harmony of differences made Greek thought unusually rich. People were not expected to choose one view. They simply allowed each perspective to illuminate a different part of existence. Walking through a Greek town during this era, one might overhear soft fragments of reflection. All things flow. All things are one. Everything mixes. Everything separates. Everything consists of particles. Mind orders the world. These were not debates. They were gentle entries into contemplation, spoken softly during evening meals, morning walks, or quiet rest beneath shaded porticos. The world remained the same as ever. The sea breathing in slow tides. The hills rising in soft curves. The stars returning in familiar cycles. But the way people saw the world had deepened. They sensed layers beneath appearances, processes beneath events, principles beneath experiences. They had not yet reached the age of Socrates, Plato, or Aristotle. But the ground was prepared, not by dramatic upheaval, but by the calm accumulation of insight across generations. The Greek mind had learned to look beyond what the senses offered, to imagine what could not be seen, to reflect without urgency, and to expand thought as gently as a sunrise expands light across the land. And in that expanding calm, philosophy, still quiet, still young, was reaching the threshold of a new era. Experience. The accumulation of these influences produced a quiet readiness, the readiness to approach thought itself as something worth examining. Across Greece, conversations changed tone. In marketplaces, people discussed not only prices and goods but principles. In workshops, artisans wondered whether the behavior of materials reflected universal laws. In sanctuaries, worshippers asked whether divine order and natural order could be understood together. In homes, families reflected on why certain customs persisted across generations. The world did not become more philosophical in a dramatic sense. It became more curious. A potter, shaping clay on a wheel, might pause and consider whether the circular motion mirrored the movement of the heavens. A farmer, observing the growth of vines, might reflect on Empedocles' idea that unity and separation governed nature. But resting under a tree wondered whether his beliefs came from tradition or thought. A merchant negotiating prices reflected on fairness and deception. A group of young men debating at a gymnasium considered whether courage came from habit or nature. Parents teaching children stories questioned which stories taught wisdom and which taught fear. This emerging interest in the human condition, ethics, knowledge, purpose, the nature of a good life, was the quiet next step in philosophy's unfolding. And it arose naturally from centuries of earlier thought. If everything had a structure, if the world followed patterns, if matter was composed of elements or particles, if forces guided change, if mind ordered mixtures, if being lay beneath appearance, then people began asking, what about us? Do our thoughts follow patterns? Can our beliefs be examined? Is there a principle guiding our choices? Is there a truth within the human mind? Such questions were new, yet they felt familiar, like paths extending from well-known roads. The Greek world was ready for them. Even artists contributed to this shift. Painters experimented with perspective, subtly hinting that perception shaped reality. Dramatists explored character, motive, conflict, and resolution, inviting audiences to consider why people acted as they did. Architects built structures whose symmetry and ratio suggested not only physical order but moral balance. Through these influences, people began to understand the inner life as something worthy of attention. Philosophy expanded softly inward. In small gatherings, people discussed what it meant to be virtuous. In marketplaces, someone might ask whether knowledge required certainty or simply understanding. In gymnasia, groups of youths debated fate and choice. In symposia, adults reflected on love, justice, and friendship. None of this displaced earlier ideas. It simply grew beside them. A new branch of the same quiet tree. Meanwhile, Athens, with its busy streets and open-air meeting places, became a natural home for this shift. Its people, accustomed to discussion and debate, found themselves surrounded by questions about how one ought to live, rather than only what the world was made of. Into this atmosphere stepped Socrates. But in the final decades before he began speaking, no one yet knew who he would become. He moved through a world already softened by centuries of reflection. The merchants, artisans, teachers, sailors, and youths he encountered were not strangers to thought. They had inherited a landscape rich with perspectives, each offering gentle guidance on how to understand reality. When Socrates eventually began asking his calm, probing questions. What do you mean by courage? What is justice? How do you know what you claim to know? He was not planting seeds in barren soil. He was tending a garden already quietly flourishing. A garden cultivated by Thales's wonder, by Anaximander's boundless, by Heraclitus' flow, by Parmenides' being, by Empedocles' elements, by Anaxagoras' mind, by Democritus' atoms, and by countless unnamed voices, who carried these reflections through generations. And so, the slow birth of philosophy in ancient Greece did not culminate in one figure. It culminated in a world ready for deeper inquiry. A world where questions became companions. Where thinking was woven into daily life. Where truth was approached through gentle persistence. The dawn of Socrates, and later Plato and Aristotle, would brighten this landscape. But the light they carried did not arise suddenly. It was prepared by centuries of soft illumination. Lamps lit quietly in workshops. Ideas shared calmly in courtyards. Reflections whispered beneath olive trees. Thoughts drifted across seas and mountains. By the end of this long, slow unfolding, the Greek world had learned not only to look outward at nature, but to look inward at the soul. And philosophy, once a simple curiosity about the world, became a way of living, a gentle companionship, a slow, steady guide in the quiet hours of human life.